In 1981, Maurice Doc Demetz was an 84-year-old man living in Colorado. He was a lifelong minister, had a PhD in theology. He also had a blood condition, and he had arthritis in his knees that made it almost impossible for him to walk without assistance. He had always been really passionate about topaz hunting. He would go to these sites where you could dig into the ground and look for these rocks. When you broke them open, you could potentially find topaz. And he loved doing that. Because of his knees and because of his blood condition, he needed someone to go with him to walk him around to the different dig sites and to help him get back into the car and drive him back to his house. Doc had a friend named David McSherry. He wound up being the primary guy that would go with Doc anytime he went topaz hunting. On April 29th, 1981, Doc decides he wants to go topaz hunting. So he calls up David, and they load up David's car, and they head off to Pike National Forest, which was a spot they had gone many times before. And they had this one area that they used to love going in particular called Devil's Head. Locals in the area claimed that that spot was actually haunted by evil spirits. But to Doc and to David, there was no indication that they bought into any of that, and they went there all the time. When they got there on April 29th at 10 a.m., they got out, they went to their favorite dig sites. David actually walked Doc down this hill to this one little clearing. Doc had a backpack with him full of the tools he used to dig out the different rocks. After David had walked Doc to this spot, David walked back up the hill towards their car and went about 50 yards away from where Doc was to his dig site. And over the next several hours, the two would work independent of one another, just digging for topaz. Periodically, David would look over and he'd make sure that he could see Doc and make sure Doc was okay. At 3:45 in the afternoon, David decides, all right, it's probably time to get going soon. And he pokes his head up and he looks in the direction of where Doc was supposed to be, and Doc's not there. He had just seen him about 15 minutes earlier, so he's not concerned. He knows it's only been a few minutes, and frankly, Doc can't really go anywhere. He can barely walk. And so he just kind of stands up and maybe tries to get a better look, and he's thinking, okay, maybe Doc stood up and got behind a tree to relieve himself, or maybe he kind of is just out of sight, and he starts walking down to the area to just go find Doc. But Doc isn't there, and neither is his backpack with all of his tools. And David's sitting there thinking, I guess Doc must have packed up and headed back to the car. But then David's thinking to himself, in order to go from this dig site up to the car, it means walking up a fairly steep embankment. And there's no way that Doc would have been able to do that without assistance. And so he's looking around the area thinking, is there any sign of something bad happening here? There's no blood. There's no sign of any sort of altercation that would have happened here. David certainly didn't hear anything going on near him. He didn't hear an animal attack or anything like that. So he thinks, okay, somehow he must have got up to the car. David walks up the embankment all the way to the car. Doc's not up there. David goes in the car and he starts honking the horn and yelling out for Doc. No response. As he's honking the horn, 3 motorists come down the road. They see David honking the horn, and so they say, hey, what's going on? David tells them, hey, I got my 84-year-old friend. I don't know where he went. He can't have gone far. Can you guys help me look for him? But after David and these motorists spend a couple of hours looking in this area and there's no sign of him, they end up calling the authorities. The police show up, and over the next week, there is this extensive search in this whole area that includes bloodhounds and hundreds of people. But despite this massive effort, nothing is ever found of Doc. He just vanishes. And so Doc's wife writes a letter to the governor of Colorado and just says, he can't have done this on his own. He can't have walked away on his own. Someone or something lifted him up and took him away. There was no response to this letter, and ultimately Doc's case was shut down. They stopped looking for him and assumed he had died. But when David Paulides looked into this case and featured the Doc Demetz case on his documentary, they actually reopened the case. But as of right now, there's no new additional details about the whereabouts of Doc Demetz. To this day, we don't know what happened to him. Around midday on September 16th, 2008, the captain of the Staten Island Ferry in New York City was looking out at the water just south of Manhattan, and he noticed something bobbing in the water. And he said that it just didn't look right. He was drawn to it. It was pretty far away, but he knew that there was just something off about it. Couldn't tell if it was a person or debris, but either way, he sent 2 of his deckhands over to have a look. So they hopped in a skiff, they drove over, and very quickly they saw that it was actually a woman, and her face was in the water. So as soon as they pulled up alongside her, the first thing they did is grabbed her head and kind of pulled it out of the water, and to their surprise, she gasped for air. They pulled her up into the skiff. She had on just running shorts and a sports bra. She had a very bad sunburn on one side of her body. She was hypothermic, she was dehydrated, and she looked like she had been in the water for a very long time. They bring her back to the ferry, they wrap her up in a blanket, and they call 911, and an ambulance is immediately sent out to go get her. As they're waiting for the ambulance, she starts to speak. "I was just out for a run. I went running just a couple hours ago. Why am I here?" They chalked it up to her being in shock, and based on her attire, she had running shorts and a sports bra on, they're thinking, okay, I don't know how she wound up in the water, but it seems like she went running, fell in the water somehow, and thank goodness we found her. She gets in the ambulance, they bring her to the hospital, and after the initial treatment is done and she's stable and laying in bed and being treated for hypothermia and for this bad sunburn, she starts saying to nurses and doctors she had just gone running like a couple hours ago. How did I get here? Why was I in the water? And they didn't know either. Finally, when she was able to confirm that she was in fact Hannah Up, and they got in touch with her family, who also confirmed that this girl sitting in the hospital bed is in fact Hannah Up, investigators were baffled because Hannah Up had been missing for 3 weeks, not one day. When they said this to Hannah, she couldn't believe it. At first, everyone was okay with Hannah not being able to remember because she just went through something traumatic. We'll give her a couple of days and then we'll reapproach the subject. But as time went on, it became clear that Hannah had absolutely no clue what happened over a 3-week period that she had been missing. 3 weeks before she was found, she had left her apartment in New York City to go for a run. This was the day before she was set to start a new school year at her school in Harlem. When Hannah did not return to her apartment that night, her roommates actually didn't think much of it. From what I can tell, the roommates were not particularly close, and it wasn't unusual for them to kind of have limited interaction. 4 days would go by before Hannah's roommates would notice that she still hasn't come back. So the first thing they did is they went into her bedroom inside of the apartment, and they quickly were able to find that her passport was in there, her wallet with her cash, bank cards, her ID. Basically, all of the most important items that you would carry with you anywhere you went were sitting in her room. At this point, they called the police, and a massive, massive search is ignited for this woman. Hannah was beloved, not only by her family, but everywhere she went, her students loved her. All of her friends would say that Hannah was their best friend. Everybody she was around loved her. She was the center of attention, life of the party. And so when she became a missing person, people came out of the woodwork to go look for this woman. They looked everywhere. And after a week, the family and friends were starting to lose hope, and the police would admit that at that point, they were just looking for a body. They assumed that she had been the victim of some horrible crime. Her case, her missing person case, had made national headlines because it didn't really make any sense. There was absolutely no trace of her. She'd just gone running and then vanished. And despite living in New York City, where there's cameras everywhere and witnesses everywhere, they couldn't find any footage of her. They had no leads. No one came forward. The New York Times would say it was as if the city had opened wide and swallowed her whole. Then there was this huge break in the case because there was an Apple store in Midtown Manhattan that spotted her clearly entering their store and logging into one of their computers. They saw that she logged in with her email address, but on that computer there was no record of her sending or receiving any messages. But she did successfully log in. And oddly enough, one of the people that went to school with her approached her and was like, Hannah? Hannah, is that you? There's a huge search for you. Is this really you? Hannah on camera looks at him and says, no, I'm not Hannah. And she ups and walks away. Police show up. There's no sign of Hannah. She's gone. Police took the footage and showed it to Hannah's mother, and she recognized her 100%. That is Hannah. But no one could understand, why would she deny being Hannah? Is she being held hostage? A day later, she popped up on the security camera at a Starbucks in Manhattan. But just like the Apple store, by the time the report got to the police and they went to the Starbucks, she was gone. Same thing happened at a number of Manhattan gyms where she was apparently going and using their shower and then leaving. And she somehow was able to get inside the gym, but she didn't have her gym pass. So they don't know how she got in. And again, every time police showed up, she'd be gone. And there's lots of other unanswered questions. How are you able to do anything? You don't have your license, you don't have your wallet, you don't have bank cards, you don't have a passport. We don't know where you're sleeping, where you're staying. How are you eating? What are you doing? Where are you coming from? What's wrong? While police were never able to determine where she had been sleeping at night in those first couple of weeks, they did determine that at some point towards the end of this 3-week period, she decided to leave Manhattan. And so she jumped into a kayak off of Chelsea Pier and began paddling south. And at some point, we don't know when, she jumped out of the kayak and began swimming south. And after several hours of swimming, she wound up at Robbins Reef, which is this incredibly isolated lighthouse that sits on this tiny little rocky island. She managed to pull herself up onto the island and then sat there on these rocks for almost 24 hours. This is where police believe she got the really bad sunburn. Then some event led to her getting back in the water and kind of bobbing and drifting her way all the way back over to the south side of Manhattan, where she was ultimately spotted and then rescued by the ferry captain. It took police and investigators quite a bit of time to put together this storyline of what happened to Hannah over those 3 weeks. And when they brought it to her and her family and said, "This is what we think happened to you," she still had no idea how any of this had happened. She thought she'd gone running, and then the same day she wound up in the water and was being rescued. While she was at the hospital, she had undergone a series of brain imaging tests to try to see what they could find, if there was some underlying neurological condition that might have caused her to forget this huge chunk of time. But the tests revealed no neurological issues. They concluded that the episode was psychological in nature. Because her case had made national headlines just when she had gone missing in the first place, and then had been found under such baffling conditions, not only physically where she was located, but her inability to remember any of it, it created even more buzz around the whole story. And so people began to think she was lying or that she had staged the whole thing, but she hadn't. She just didn't understand why it had happened. But as time went on, people forgot about it, people moved on, and she was able to more or less go back to a normal life, even though she herself was very unsettled at the idea that she had 20 days that she has no memory of. Fast forward almost exactly 5 years to September of 2013, and now Hannah is living in Maryland. She is an assistant teacher at a Montessori school, and Hannah goes missing again. On the day she went missing, co-workers claimed to have seen her just a couple miles away from the school, and they assumed that she was walking to work. But she didn't show up for work that day, and when they tried calling her, she didn't pick up. They went to her apartment, she wasn't there, and so just like 5 years earlier, they called the police and they launched a search for Hannah up. Early on in the search, police located Hannah's phone and wallet sitting on a walking path relatively close to where she worked. But they started searching the area and they could not find her. 2 days after the search started, Hannah's mother received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. When she picked it up, it was her daughter. And she said, "I don't know where I am, I don't know what's going on, but I'm okay." Hannah had regained her memory while laying in a creek bed next to a turned over shopping cart in some random park in Maryland, not the one where her phone and wallet were found. She had stood up, had no idea how she got there, and she flagged down a stranger and asked to use their phone and was able to call her mother. Her family, her friends, the police were all so relieved that she was found and unharmed that, much like the last one, she ultimately was released from the hospital because she wasn't hurt and was able to more or less move back into a normal life. Except Hannah at this point felt really guilty. She didn't understand why this was happening, but she felt really bad about it. And it was clear to her family and friends that she really wished she could somehow have a do-over, to just start fresh and start a new life where no one knew her as this person who keeps disappearing. A year after the Maryland incident, Hannah would move to the US Virgin Islands, a popular location for Americans that want to start again or go off the grid. She was able to land a job teaching at a Montessori school teaching 3 to 6-year-old children, and the director of the program would say that whenever they brought a family on a tour of the different classrooms, Hannah's classroom was always the first one they went to because she was such a great example of what children would expect if they came to this Montessori school. Because Hannah was not just a great teacher, she was a passionate teacher. She loved teaching, she loved her students, and she loved her new life in the Virgin Islands. But in September 2017, 9 years after her disappearance in New York and 4 years after her disappearance in Maryland, Hannah would go missing for a third time. Now, the lead up to this disappearance is a little bit unique relative to the other two. Right before she disappeared, there was a Category 5 hurricane barreling down on the Virgin Islands. And all of Hannah's friends, colleagues, everyone she knew was scrambling to leave the islands before it hit. But Hannah was not prepared to abandon the island and abandon her house and her school, and so she decides to stay behind. In the final few days before all of her friends and colleagues left the island, they described Hannah as being in some sort of a trance. She was hard to get through to, hard to speak to, but she seemed rather sing-songy, like she was in a really good mood, but very difficult to communicate with. On September 15th, just a few days before the hurricane would actually make landfall, the few staff members at the Montessori school who had stayed behind on the island to weather the storm called a meeting, and Hannah was not present. She was last seen preparing her Montessori classroom for the imminent impact of the hurricane. When they went to her apartment, she wasn't there, and so they went out looking for her. One of her friends knew that a favorite location of Hannah's was Sapphire Beach, and when she got there, sure enough, there was Hannah's car parked in the parking lot with her purse, passport, and hundreds of dollars inside of her car. Hannah's clothes were found down on the beach on a chair, neatly folded, but there was no sign of Hannah anywhere. A desperate search for Hannah was launched, led by the Coast Guard, but it had to be abandoned after only a couple of days because the hurricane was barreling down on them. And to this day, she has never been seen or heard from again. There's a huge part of this story that I've intentionally left out until right now. After Hannah was scooped up by the ferry captain and brought to the hospital after that first disappearance in 2008, they ran all those brain tests and they discovered that there was nothing wrong with her from a neurological standpoint. However, they did run a series of psychological tests and they discovered that she had an extremely rare form of amnesia called dissociative fugue. For those that suffer it, there are no symptoms leading up to it, and then all of a sudden you forget all of your autobiographical information, but you don't forget how to live. Someone in a fugue state could very easily leave their apartment, go to a store, interact with other people. They just don't understand who they are. They don't know their name. They don't know their history. They don't know why they are located where they are. This can last for a couple of hours, all the way to years. The most famous example of dissociative fugue is Jason Bourne from the big blockbuster movies about the CIA operative who wakes up and has no idea who he is or why he is where he is. He doesn't know the people around him, but he recalls all of his training and is able to be this like ninja who can fight off bad guys left and right but doesn't know who he is. Now, when Hannah disappeared in 2008, almost certainly she was in a fugue state and then was located again, and thankfully she was alive. 5 years later, same thing happens in Maryland. She goes into a fugue state, and then 2 days later she's found again, has no idea how she got where she got, but there she was. Now the tricky part is, in 2017 when she went missing, it would be very easy to say that she was in a fugue state because it had already happened 2 times before. However, other people believe that she just wanted to start her life over again. She hated being known only for her 2 disappearances. She wanted to be known as a happy, loving person, a great teacher, a great friend. And none of that was possible with her history. And so some say that she staged the last disappearance because she knew with the hurricane coming in that she would be able to kind of disappear without a trace and people would assume that she was probably dead. So I'd love to get your take on what happened to Hannah Up, specifically what happened the 3rd time she disappeared. Was this just another example of her being in a fugue state and disappearing? And will we hear from her again? Or did she stage all of this to run away from Hannah Up and start all over again with a brand new identity, not tethered to the history that she really would like to forget? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll do my best to get back to as many of you as I possibly can. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, then I would encourage you to steal the like button's favorite bar of soap, cover it in clear nail varnish, and then replace it, and laugh at the like button when their soap doesn't lather. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads that sound an awful lot like what you just listened to today. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I also post quite a bit over on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen. So whether I see you on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, or some combination, I'm just very thankful for your support. And until next time, see you guys. In 1958, Bobby Bisup was a 10-year-old living in Colorado. He was almost completely deaf, so he wore a hearing aid, and he came from a family that was devoutly Catholic. That summer, Bobby's family decided to send him to a Catholic camp for boys. It was located at the St. Malo Church inside of Rocky Mountain National Park. The camp itself was situated at the base of Mount Meeker. Anytime the boys were up the mountain, which was pretty steep, they could always look down and see this camp. In addition, there was this stream that fed right by the camp. So if they could just get to the stream anytime they were up in the mountain, they could follow it all the way down and get back to the camp. This was something that they told all of the boys in case they got lost up in the mountain. On August 15th, around 6 p.m., Bobby was a little ways up from the camp fishing along that river. And one of the camp counselors was making his way up to try to get all the boys to come back down for dinner. This camp counselor would say that he clearly saw Bobby recognize that it was time to come back down, it was time for dinner. He clearly saw Bobby turn and start walking down towards the camp. At which point the counselor turned his back on Bobby and he too began walking down towards the camp, which was not very far away. When the counselor got to the camp and turned back around though, Bobby was gone. And so the counselor starts immediately tracing his steps back to try to find Bobby, but he can't find him anywhere. The counselor goes and gets a number of the other counselors to come help him find Bobby. After about 30 minutes, no sign of Bobby. He's just gone. The camp counselors are looking around thinking, how is this possible? He was literally right there. He started walking, he was right behind me. How could he have gotten lost in such a short amount of time and in an area where he could literally see the camp and was actually on the river that leads right back to the camp? It didn't make any sense. The counselors alerted authorities and this massive search is launched to find Bobby. Over 300 people come out, including people from the military. It's this huge search and nothing is found of this boy. He's completely gone. 10 days after he went missing, they had to call off the search because there was absolutely no sign of this child. Even after the search ended, many of the camp counselors continued to, in their off time, scour the area around the camp to look for Bobby. And a year later, 3 camp counselors would actually find him. 3 camp counselors decided to go to a very hard to access area that had been searched previously, but they felt like it was the one spot that needed a little bit more attention. And it was 5 kilometers west of the camp and almost 800 yards up a fairly steep incline. This is a hard to access area, but they climbed their way up there, and sure enough, even though this area had been searched before, they found Bobby's hearing aid, bits of his clothing, and some of his bones. They didn't find any more of his remains, and no one knows what actually happened to him. But it really makes you wonder, what happened after the camp counselor turned his back on Bobby? It's as if someone scooped him up and flew him away. And even if he had intentionally run away, it would have been very difficult for a 10-year-old to get to that particular location where he was found. And to what end? Why would he have wanted to get up there? And so, like many of the other missing 411 cases, we are left with a series of questions and very few answers. So I'd love to get your theories as to what's causing these strange disappearances, and I'll do my best to get back to as many people as I can. So if you enjoyed today's stories, I would encourage you, if you have not already, to sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of their family pictures with pictures of Steve Buscemi. Also, please subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4, even 5 video uploads. If you're interested in learning more about the missing 411 phenomenon, I provided links below to David Paulides and his team. If you have story suggestions for this channel, I have a subreddit called MrBallen. It's linked below in the description, and you can just drop your story suggestions right in there. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. In 2014, Jim McGrogan was a 39-year-old medical doctor who was living in Indiana with his wife and his 2 kids. He was widely regarded as a very loving husband and devoted father, and everybody seemed to just love this guy. Jim was in phenomenal shape. He had run marathons, triathlons. He loved being in the outdoors, hiking, rock climbing, snowshoeing, skiing. That was Jim's happy place. And so in early March 2014, Jim decides he wants to plan a trip with some friends to go hiking in Colorado. And so he begins planning out where they're going to go hiking, and he finds this amazing trail right opposite the very famous Vail ski resort. Even though Jim was very competent in the outdoors, he would take a survival class and an avalanche preparedness class before he left for Colorado, just to show his wife that he wasn't taking any chances, that he would be well prepared in case the worst were to happen on this trip. About 2 weeks later, he's in Colorado and he heads to a ski shop where he rents a split snowboard as well as loads up on all the supplies that you might need for being in the outdoors. Early the next day, Jim and his friends arrive at the trailhead. Jim, in his backpack, had his cell phone. He also had an extra cell phone battery. He had a great GPS. In addition, he had loads of food and water. He had his split snowboard. He has his avalanche beacon. He's got extra clothing. I mean, this guy is well outfitted for this trip. So they start on this hike, and by 10 a.m. that morning, the rest of the group is feeling tired and wants to take a break. Jim doesn't want to take a break. He's in amazing shape and he wants to keep going. So he says, hey guys, I'm going to walk just a little bit farther up and I'll meet you at our next planned stop. No one bats an eye because Jim is like this total stud. He knows what he's doing. And they're like, all right, go ahead. We'll see you up there. Once the group is well rested, they stand back up and they keep walking. They get to that first stop and Jim's not there. They think, okay, we were sitting there for a little while. I'm sure he just went to the next planned stop because they had planned stops all along the route. The trail they were on, because it had snowed significantly that winter and lots of people had been on this trail, the trail itself was totally packed down to the dirt. So it was very easy to identify this trail. Anywhere there wasn't trail was covered in snow. And so if you were walking this trail, it would be really easy to stay on it. Also, if you were to deviate from the trail and start walking away, it would be really obvious because people would see your footprints leaving the trail. But as Jim's friends are making their way up this trail and not seeing Jim at each of these subsequent stops, they don't see any footprints leaving the trail. So they just figure he must have gone all the way to the end. He's just way ahead of us. But by 5 p.m., when they made it all the way up to the top where they planned on stopping and turning around, Jim wasn't there, and they hadn't passed him on the way up, and they hadn't seen any footprints or any ski tracks or anything to indicate that someone had left the path. And so very worried about Jim, they called the authorities. Over the next 5 days, a massive search is launched in this area, including 3 helicopters that scoured an 18-mile square radius. They had scent sniffing dogs out there. They had all these very experienced mountaineers combing the area, but they couldn't find any sign of him. And again, because of all the snow outside of that trail they were on, the helicopter just searched up and down that trail looking for indications that someone had left the trail, looking for those footprints or ski tracks just off that trail they were on, and there weren't any. There was no sign that anyone had left the trail at any point. Yet Jim was gone. The authorities, friends, family, everybody's baffled, but they're thinking to themselves, Jim's a really competent outdoorsman. He has a working GPS. And they checked their cell phones. That whole area they were in, they had cell phone reception. So they're thinking to themselves, we don't know what's going on, but I'm sure he's going to turn up at some point. 20 days after Jim went missing, his body is discovered by 2 hikers 7 kilometers away from the trail he had been on when he went missing. He had died from significant head trauma as well as a broken femur. It looked like he had fallen from a really great height, but it wasn't entirely clear where he had actually fallen from. He was found with just leggings and a shirt on, no jacket and no boots, and his boots were nowhere to be found. His backpack was next to him, and inside of it was his GPS that worked and his cell phone that worked. He even had an extra battery for his cell phone, yet at no point had he tried to use his cell phone over the duration of the time he had been out there. He also had lots of food and water and additional clothing. He had a tent, but it looked like none of it had been touched since he packed it originally. And then strangest of all is there were no footprints or ski tracks leading up to either where he was or any of the surrounding areas. There were no tracks to show how he actually got where he got. It's as if he had been lifted off the trail 7 kilometers away and dropped where he was. When the exact location of where he was found was communicated back to the authorities, the helicopter pilots who had been involved in that initial 5-day search said that we looked at that area multiple times and he wasn't there. So at some point after those 5 days, Jim had found a way to land 7 kilometers away in this random place where there's no footprints that lead to it, no tracks, no anything. We know he had a working cell phone and a working GPS, and we know that he didn't make it to this spot where he ultimately was found in the first 5 days. So at a minimum, what was he doing in those first 5 days? Why wasn't he using his cell phone to communicate what was going on? Why wasn't he using his GPS to get back to safety? Why didn't he use the supplies in his backpack to save his life? Why did he take his boots off? And then how did he wind up in the location he was in? Because there was no tracks that would have led to that spot. On the night of October 17th, 2019, a 47-year-old woman named Ada Quintal stepped out of her family's cabin in rural Michigan to take her dog for a walk and have a smoke. It was very late. It was about 1:30 in the morning. Now, this cabin where she was staying was very isolated. It was about a half-mile away from any neighbors, but Ada actually enjoyed the solitude. She was surrounded on all sides by forest and swamps, and the wilderness actually made Ada feel a lot safer than when she was back home in the densely populated Detroit area where she lived full-time. And this was because just a few months earlier, when she had been back home in Detroit, she had been the victim of an unprovoked attack. She had been out in the city around all these people in broad daylight, and this guy came up to her and just jumped her, broke her nose, gave her a concussion, and then ran off. But the scariest part of this attack was not the fact that she had been brutalized. It was that this guy did not appear to have any reason to attack her. He didn't know Ada, and Ada had not been robbed or anything. It was like he just randomly identified her and attacked her. And the guy had never been caught. And so this ordeal had had such a profound impact on Ada that it really began to affect her health, both mentally and physically. She started to just kind of decline. And on top of that, she had been laid off from her engineering job, and so now she was unemployed and seriously depressed. And so recently, when Ada's uncle had called her and offered to pay her to come out and live in this 2-story family cabin and fix it up for the winter, Ada had jumped at the chance. I mean, not only would this solve her unemployment issue, but also she loved this cabin. It had been in her family for 75 years, and some of her fondest childhood memories were in this cabin. And so she looked at this as a chance to kind of get away from the city and just be in her happy place and kind of reset and recover from the trauma of the attack. And so for the past week, Ada and her boyfriend had been staying in this cabin and doing small repairs and cleaning it up. But 2 days earlier, her boyfriend had had to leave and go back to the city where they were actually fixing up another property, a condo. And so now it was just Ada and her dog. But that was totally fine with Ada. She liked being out here by herself, so this was no big deal. But tonight, she was feeling frustrated because she couldn't sleep. About an hour earlier, she had taken a pill to help her sleep, but so far it hadn't worked, and so she was feeling kind of wired and anxious. And so she had decided to go on a walk with her dog in hopes that that would clear her mind and allow her to finally get some rest. Now, these roads that surrounded this cabin were kind of small and zigzaggy, and there weren't any street lights. I mean, this is not exactly a good place to go for a nighttime walk. But Ada knew this place like the back of her hand, and she also carried a 9mm pistol in her pocket, just for protection. And so after walking for a few minutes down one of these dark, winding roads, Ada's dog stopped to relieve himself on a bush. So as the dog was going to the bathroom, Ada just casually smoked and waited. But at some point, the dog just stopped going to the bathroom, turned slightly, and began growling, and its ears perked up, and it was looking off into the darkness right ahead of them. And so Ada instinctively took her flashlight and raised it up and aimed it in the direction her dog was looking. And right away, the cone of light illuminated these 2 eyes looking right back at Ada. And immediately Ada knew what she was staring at. It was a mountain lion. And so doing her best to stay calm, Ada slowly reached into her pocket to pull out her gun, but before pulling it out, the 2 eyes blinked shut, and then she heard it kind of turn and run off into the forest. It was gone. Once Ada was sure the mountain lion really was gone, she breathed a sigh of relief, and then very quickly tugged on her dog's leash. They turned around, and she hustled back towards the cabin. When Ada reached her cabin, which was all lit up because she had left all the lights on before she had left, she jumped up the front steps, she opened up the door, she went inside with her dog, and after letting her dog off the leash, she shut and locked the door. Then she grabbed her phone and texted her boyfriend to tell him about this mountain lion. And then after hitting send, Ada felt relieved to be back in her cabin, but at the same time, she still felt very on edge. I mean, she had been, just a few feet away from a mountain lion in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. But as Ada was doing her best to calm herself down, she heard this noise coming from outside the living room window, almost like twig snapping, like somebody was walking past the window. And so the way this cabin was set up is when you first walked inside, you were in the kitchen, and then the back half of the cabin was a living room, and then there were also stairs leading up to a second floor. But from in the kitchen, you had a clear line of sight into the living room, and vice versa. It was kind of like one big room with 2 functions. And so from where Ada was standing in the kitchen, she could clearly see the window in the living room where this noise had kind of come through. But because the inside of the cabin was all lit up and the outside was dark, from her perspective, all she could see was a reflection on that window. So to look outside that window to see what had made that noise, she would need to get right up next to the window. And so feeling pretty nervous at this point, she walked across the cabin, she made her way towards this window, and then she pressed her face right up against the glass to look outside. But all she saw outside was just darkness. I mean, there was nothing out there.
And so Ada stepped back from the window and started to wonder if maybe the sound she had just heard was maybe that mountain lion. Maybe it followed her back here. That was terrifying, but at least she was inside. But also she was thinking to herself, mountain lions are not known for being aggressive towards humans, and they wouldn't come up to her cabin like this and prowl around outside. That's just not what mountain lions do. But Ada didn't really have any other explanation, and so she told herself, it's gotta be nothing, there's nothing out there, this is a safe place. And so she kind of forgot about the noise, and she took off her coat and put her stuff down, and then she sat down on the couch in the living room, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. But only about 20 minutes later, when Ada had finally relaxed and was even thinking about getting into her bed and going to sleep, she heard another noise coming from that same window in the living room. And this time, when she looked up and looked out that window, despite the reflections inside the cabin, she could clearly tell there was something moving outside of her cabin. And it was definitely not a mountain lion. It looked like a man. And so Ada had to stifle a scream, and then instinctively she lunged for her gun on the coffee table and then darted behind the couch and crouched down to make sure whoever was out there couldn't see her. And then, with gun in hand, she began calling out to the person out there that, "Hey, I'm armed. If you come in here, I'm going to shoot you." But it was just silence. And then Ada strained her ears to try to hear any sound that would give away where this person went. Were they still outside that window? Had they moved somewhere else? But all she could hear was the sound of the wind whipping outside and an owl hooting off in the distance. But then, right as Ada was starting to wonder, did I really see somebody out there? Is this all in my head? That's when she heard the distinct sound of footsteps on her front porch. And so again, Ada had to stifle a scream, and she darted to the other side of the couch, preventing the person from the front of the house to seeing her now. Then she grabbed her phone and she was dialing 911, and she was about to hit call when she stopped herself. And she began to wonder, am I just totally overreacting here? I don't know if there's somebody out there. I could be hearing things. Or maybe it's just like an animal or something. And also, deep down, Ada knew that ever since that attack in Detroit that summer, that basically everything scared her. And she was starting to wonder if maybe she was just being totally paranoid and there was nothing going on. And she didn't want to embarrass herself by calling 911 and having them come out here and finding nothing. And so Ada decided she would call her boyfriend, and so she called her boyfriend, and as the phone is ringing, she's listening intently for any other footsteps outside, but she can't hear anything. And then her boyfriend, he didn't pick up. It's also like 2:30 in the morning at this point, but her boyfriend doesn't answer. And so after that, she tries calling one of her friends, and her friend does pick up. And right away, Ada just began telling this friend about all the things that had happened that night, from going out and seeing the mountain lion, and then coming back in, hearing the sound, and now hearing the footsteps on the front porch. And, she was worried that maybe she was just making it all up, but she was still really scared. And even though Ada was trying to be composed as she was telling her friend, her voice began to crack and she began to cry because she really was scared. And the friend just said, "Look, I'm going to call the police on your behalf. It seems like it's worth having them come out just to make sure you're really okay. Give me the address and I'll tell them where to go." And so Ada would give her friend the address, but she told the friend, "Thank you, but do not call right now. Just please stay on the phone for a minute and let me just do a quick investigation. Let me look out the windows, and just really make sure that this is nothing before you call the police." And so the friend said, "Okay, look around, but then I'm calling the police." And so with her phone and her gun in hand, Ada very carefully crept out from behind the couch, keeping a low profile, staying below the sight line of all the windows. And she crept from the living room into the kitchen towards the front of the house. And she walked over to the sink, and she very slowly raised her head until she could just barely peek through the window right above the sink that overlooked the front porch. Because remember, that was the last place she had heard sounds, from the front porch. And so she very carefully peeks and looks out the window, and there's nothing there. Nobody's on the porch. It's just empty, dark forest. She's safe. Ada let out a relieved half cry, half laugh, and then stood all the way up and felt totally ridiculous because clearly she had just imagined, all these people wandering around the outside of her house. And so she was about to tell her friend that, "Hey, sorry, there is no issue here. Don't call the police." But before she could get the words out, Ada happened to turn around and was looking back towards the living room, and she froze. Because there, in that same window she had heard those sounds coming from in the living room, was now the silhouettes of two men, clear as day, just looking in the window right at Ada. And so, acting purely on instinct, Ada just raised her gun and aimed it at these two men, and to her horror, the two men also raised guns and aimed them right back at Ada. And so Ada just started firing her gun at the window, and these men began shooting back at her, and right before Ada leapt to the ground, she was pretty sure she hit one of the men in the head with one of her rounds, and so she lands on the ground. It's absolute pandemonium at this point, and her friend, who's still on the phone, is screaming like, "What's going on? What's going on?" And all Ada could think to do was yell out, "There's two men, they're shooting at me, I think I shot one of them." And the friend is screaming, "I'm gonna call the police." And then the line goes dead, and Ada, who's crouched down behind the kitchen island at this point, she realizes all the shooting has stopped. It's now dead silent in the cabin. And so for a second, Ada was thinking to herself, maybe I managed to shoot both of them, and that's why it's quiet right now. But then another thought began to enter her head, that maybe she had only shot one of them, and the other survivor was moving into position to maybe ambush her. And so as she's running through what she's gonna do, she hears this horrible, loud thumping sound right above her in the second floor of the cabin. Now, Ada knew at this moment she should just get her dog and run. Because if this second shooter has survived and has now come into her cabin and is upstairs, that means the forest is now clear and she can make a run for it. But as she sat there by the island, still clutching her gun, in this beloved family cabin of hers, she began thinking about the fact that ever since that attack in Detroit over the summer, that had totally wrecked her life and made her scared of everything. And so as she heard the sound of whoever this was marching around in her second floor, she made a decision. She was going to stand her ground and fight. And so she took a deep breath, she stood up, and with gun in hand, she made her way to the stairs and began to go up.
It's no secret that a lot of the stories I've covered over the years are about real people who have been victims of just unspeakable violence. And so that's why, back in April of 2022, we decided to launch the MrBallen Foundation, which was established to honor and support victims of violent crime and their families. And so now, over 2 years later, I'm happy to report that, with your help, because none of this would be possible without all of you, we have been able to give $1.4 million to this group of people, to these victims and their families, who are often overlooked after the news story about whatever happened to them fades. All donations that are made to the MrBallen Foundation, literally 100% of them, go out the door to the cause. Meaning if you give $10, that $10 is going to the victims, it's going to their families. This is one of the very rare nonprofits that can actually say that. If you're interested in joining the MrBallen Foundation community and contributing to this effort, all you have to do is go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Donate. Again, just go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Donate. Thank you again to all our donors, our listeners, viewers, all the people that made this possible. We are genuinely changing the world. Thank you so much, and now back to the story.
The police arrived at the cabin about 30 minutes later because Ada's friend did call the police, and she warned them that as far as she knew, there could be at least 2 gunmen there, and maybe Ada had shot one of them, she wasn't sure. And so when the police arrived, they showed up, guns drawn, and they walked up to the cabin and they searched the outside, but there was nobody out there, it was silent. And then when they made entry into the cabin, they saw clearly there had been a shootout. There were bullet holes all over the place, broken windows, but after searching the cabin top to bottom, they didn't find anybody. No Ada, no shooters. However, they did find Ada's terrified dog inside of the cabin, and the dog would be just fine. Now, once the cabin was secured of any threats, the police would do another comprehensive search looking for any evidence that would kind of tell them, where Ada or these shooters had gone. And during this secondary search, they would find Ada's shoes and her cell phone on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find her gun on the ground not far from the roof, suggesting maybe she had fallen off the roof or jumped from the roof, but they were kind of located roughly in the same area. And during this secondary search, they wouldn't find Ada or the gunman, but they would find Ada's cell phone and her shoes on the roof of the cabin, and they would also find Ada's gun on the ground not far from where her shoes and cell phone had been found. But that was it. Police immediately launched a massive search in the forest surrounding the cabin, but despite looking all over the place, they could not find any signs of Ada or her attackers. Police checked local hospitals to see if maybe the man that Ada had shot had shown up seeking medical attention, but as far as they could tell, he hadn't. And so pretty quickly, the police theorized that maybe there were no gunmen. Maybe what really happened here is Ada's boyfriend attacked her, and he was responsible for whatever happened to her. But when police checked on Ada's boyfriend, it would turn out he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with Ada's adult son at the time Ada had gone missing. And Ada's own son said, yes, for sure, he was with me. He did not do this. But after that, the police thought, okay, well, maybe if Ada's boyfriend didn't do this, maybe he hired other people to hurt Ada. But there was no evidence of any strange financial transactions, and as far as they could tell when they did some digging, there was no strife in Ada and her boyfriend's relationship. So there was no clear reason why he would want to hurt her. And so that lead also kind of fell flat. Police would confirm that Ada was attacked that previous summer by this random guy in Detroit, and so for a little while they speculated that, maybe this guy, this attacker, who had never been caught, had maybe tracked Ada down to finish off the job. But that seemed so far-fetched and just unlikely that basically was shut down as well. And as the days passed, the evidence that was coming in only made the case more confusing. For example, there were all these bullets fired during this big shootout in the cabin, and when they examined the actual bullets they extracted from the walls and the floor and the ceiling, they were all from Ada's gun. However, outside and inside the cabin, they found all these different shell casings, suggesting that those bullets had been fired from different weapons, i.e., maybe the attacker's weapons. And so as the weeks passed by and Ada and her attackers were not found, people began to speculate that, maybe this was all an elaborate setup by Ada just so she could disappear. Or other people thought maybe she was abducted by aliens. I mean, there were lots of theories surrounding this, but basically nobody knew what happened. And then pretty soon, the case just went completely cold. That is, until December 21st, 2019, so about 2 months after Ada's disappearance. And on that day, Ada's family decided to drain a pond that was near that cabin in the woods. At this point, the family was so desperate for closure that they were prepared to do just about anything to find Ada and to figure out what happened to her. And so even though this pond had previously been searched by the police, they drained this pond, and sure enough, they find Ada. She was deceased, and her body was found about 300 yards away from the cabin, and she was covered in only about a foot of water. Now, initially, the speculation was, well, here you go. She must have been chased out of her cabin by these attackers, and she was shot and killed, and this is where she fell. But after a quick examination of her body, it was clear she had no bullet wounds on her anywhere. In fact, she didn't even have any bruises on her or any major scrapes or cuts or anything, so it didn't even seem like she had been in any sort of physical struggle at all before she died. In fact, unless she had drowned, it really just seemed totally unclear how she had died. It was not until the medical examiner did Ada's autopsy that all this baffling evidence began to make sense. It would turn out, in the wake of that horrible random attack that Ada had suffered over the summer, that Ada was actually doing far worse than she let on to her family and friends. She had basically begun to cope with her trauma and anxiety with substance abuse. And so on the night that she had died, she was likely feeling totally stressed out and anxious, and she couldn't sleep as a result. And so she had taken some Valium, which is a fairly strong sedative, and also some anti-anxiety medication, but after taking those pills, she still wasn't tired. And so that was when she decided to, go out for a walk with her dog, to clear her head, and have a smoke. But it was not cigarettes that she was smoking. She was smoking methamphetamine, known simply as meth. And meth is a very strong stimulant that people like because it makes them feel very strong and confident and alert, which for Ada was a powerful antidote to the helplessness she was feeling all the time from the attack she had suffered that summer. But one of the many downsides of meth is that it can make you extremely paranoid. And so during her walk that night, as she's smoking meth, she sees a mountain lion, which terrifies her, and then after the mountain lion trots off, it was like that jolt of adrenaline and fear from seeing the mountain lion didn't subside because of smoking meth. It was like the meth sent her into this paranoia overdrive that she couldn't escape from. And so when Ada went back inside of her cabin, she very likely did see people in her windows. But almost certainly it was just her own reflection, but again, she's in this meth-induced paranoid state, and so instead of realizing it was her own reflection, she thought it was like intruders coming to get her. And before long, she'd raised her gun and thought the people outside were raising their gun back at her, but again, it's just her reflection, and so when she was shooting, she was basically having a shootout with herself. And then as for, the strange noises she was hearing, like the footsteps on the second floor, very likely those were just natural sounds kind of happening outside. She's out in the middle of a forest. There's lots of noises that are totally natural at night. But again, she's in this paranoid state, and so she went upstairs to confront the person and then didn't see anybody. And then police theorized that she must have, climbed out onto the roof to hide from these attackers. And then at some point, for reasons unknown, she leapt from the roof or climbed down or something, leaving behind her cell phone and shoes on the roof. She left her gun on the ground. And then she ran off into the forest, where she ultimately collapsed, 300 yards away in a foot of water, where she died not from drowning, but from a combination of hypothermia and also a toxic combination of drugs in her system. And so in the end, the danger that Ada was trying to escape was in her own mind.